Hello and welcome to episode 32 of the Detour 365 Bible Study podcast. And we're looking at Exodus 3. So we've it's been a couple weeks, so we did skip a week in our discussions. But we're skipping about 600 years forward in the actual material we're looking at, because the last thing we looked at was Jacob/Israel wrestling with God back in Genesis 33, I think. And now we're on to Exodus 3. And so just keep in mind, this is 600 years after our last passage we looked at. A couple of notes on context here. Moses was 80 years old when this occurred in Exodus 3.
Question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Is the Bible roughly in chronological order?
Sort of.
Okay.
And
I didn't want to derail you too much.
No.
Interesting.
Well, and I actually thought about looking at the book of Job, because I believe the book of Job, the events in there come before the events of Exodus 3. Job is at least the oldest book, right? Like the oldest written book.
Oh, really?
In the Bible. The events, I think, if you look at like a chronological reading plan, it places Job, like you'll be reading through Genesis, then all of a sudden you'll be reading Job, and then you'll be reading Genesis. So if you look at like they have chronological reading plans that, and it does kind of bounce back and forth, especially when you get into Kings, the book First and Second Kings, and First and Second Chronicles, and First and Second Samuel. It bounces back and forth because some of those cover the same events or the lives of the kings, especially Kings and Chronicles, I do believe. Yeah, there's a lot of back and forth there. So anyway, yeah, that is a good question though, because we almost did look at Job, but do we want to look at Job? Do we want to try to go chronologically, sort of, or do we want to go through the?
No, I just thought it might be interesting well, it was a curiosity of mine, but also thought it would be an interesting comment.
Yeah.
After we do the events of Moses, it might be nice to go to Job.
Yeah, I think so. That's going to be a big one. That has a lot of things to talk about in it, for sure. This section, I wasn't sure if it really fit with the theme, but it is an interaction with God and Moses, between God and Moses, and there are some aspects of this interaction that do fit the theme that we're, humanity of God theme that we're looking at. But it's such a pivotal chapter that it's hard to kind of not talk about it as well. So Moses was 80 years old. He had been comfortably living. Well, I don't want to say comfortably. He was living as a shepherd, but he was living a life in exile for 40 years he has a wife and we're not told how old his kid was, because he'd been a shepherd for 40 years, right? So we don't know if his kid was an adult at this time. Possibly. So he had at least one adult. Oh, he had two children, right? Moses had two children. Yeah. So he probably had two adult children, and he had a wife, and he was living out in the desert for 40 years, and he was 80 years old, and he was in exile. So that's kind of important to remember. And then also that the Hebrews or the Israelites had been slaves for 400 years in Egypt. So and this goes back to Genesis, they ended up settling in Egypt. If you look at the events at the end of Genesis, they ended up settling in Egypt. And then eventually they multiplied and became a great number of people, and the Egyptians enslaved them, and they were enslaved for 400 years by the time this happened. So that's is an important detail to remember when we're looking at this. Just as far as the timing of it, God is talking to Moses now when he's 80 years old, and the people have already been enslaved for 400 years. And so, Bill, would you read? Now, this is kind of a long reading because it's a whole chapter. I couldn't decide on what to cut out, but we are going to do this in at least two parts because chapter 4 is a continuation of this interaction. So God's still talking to Moses in chapter 4, but we're just going to look at chapter 3 today. So you're reading from probably
Complete
the CJB.
Bible.
All right. Get ready for your skills of guttural pronunciation.
Now for something slightly different.
Yep.
Shmot, which is Exodus chapter 3.
Schmuck? Schmuck?
Shmot.
Schmot. Oh, okay. Schmot.
What is smart?
Schmuck?
SH''MOT.
Schmot. Okay.
Which is Exodus.
All right.
Chapter 3.
Nice.
Now Moshe was tending the sheep of Yitro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Leading the flock to the far side of the desert, he came to the mountain of God, to Horeb. The angel of Adonai appeared to him in a fire blazing from the middle of a bush. He looked and saw that although the bush was flaming with fire, yet the bush was not being burned up. Moshe said to him, I'm going over and see this amazing sight and find out why the bush isn't being burned up. When Adonai saw that he had gone over to see, God called to him from the middle of the bush. Moshe, Moshe. He answered, Here I am. He said, Don't come any closer. Take your sandals off your feet, because the place where you are standing is holy ground. I am the God of your father, he continued, the God of Abraham, the God of Yitzhak, the God of Yaakov. Moshe covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. Adonai said, I have seen how my people are being oppressed in Egypt and heard their cry for release from their slave masters, because I know their pain. I have come down to rescue them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that country to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the place of the Canaanite, Hittite, Emori, Pritzai, Hivi, and Usivi. Yes, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have seen how terribly the Egyptians oppress them. Therefore, now come and I will send you to Pharaoh so that you can lead my people, the descendants of Israel, out of Egypt. Moshe said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and lead the people of Israel out of Egypt? He replied, I will surely be with you. Your sign that I have sent you will be that when you have led the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moshe said to God, look, when I appear before the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What am I to tell them? God said to Moshe, Eye, Asher, Eye, I am will be what I am will be. And added, here is what to say to the people of Israel. Eye, I am, or I will be, has sent me to you. God said further to Moshe, say this to the people of Israel. Yehvavhe Adonai, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Yitzhak, and the God of Yaakov, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is how I am to be remembered generation after generation. Go, gather the leaders of Israel together and say to them, Adonai, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has appeared to me and said, I have been paying close attention to you and have seen what is being done to you in Egypt. And I have said that I will lead you up out of the misery of Egypt to the land of the Kenai, Hittite, Emori, Fritzai, Hivi, and Yusufai, to a land flowing with milk and honey. They will heed what you say. Then you will come, and you and the leaders of Israel, before the king of Egypt, and you will tell him, Adonai, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Now, please, let us go 3 days' journey into the desert so that we can sacrifice to Adonai, our God. I know that the king of Egypt will not let you leave unless he is forced to do so. But I will reach out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders that I will do there. After that, he will let you go. Moreover, I will make the Egyptians so well disposed toward this people that when you go, you won't go empty-handed. Rather, all the women will ask their neighbors and house guests for silver and gold jewelry and clothing with which you will dress your own sons and daughters. In this way, you will plunder the Egyptians.
Very good. Most excellent.
Thank you.
So, first question is, why get Moses's attention with this burning bush? Why choose a burning bush? That's always kind of, I guess, why not choose a burning bush? But I've always found that interesting. I guess it was, I don't know. I mean, there is that, and I'm not in a. I mean, it was a spectacle for sure, you know. Um, but to me, there has to be something in the fact that it was a burning bush. Just that as a sign in and of itself that there must be some significance to it. Although, you know,
Well, it was not terribly uncommon for brush to spontaneously combust in the desert. But it was not consumed.
Yeah.
And that was something guaranteed to get Moses' attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
And getting Moses' attention was something that God wanted to do. So, well,
I mean, he could have gotten his attention with. I mean, he's God, right? By the way, how's my audio quality now? Because I swapped to my headset.
That's pretty good. It's not
Okay.
bad.
that sounds good.
I mean, he could have literally chosen anything. He had unlimited options. He could have created a small black hole. You know, I mean, so why did he choose a burning bush?
Yeah, that is a question, isn't it? And I'm sure, I mean, I could do a little more research into it, but and I don't agree with this theory, but I have heard the theory postulated that I'm only mentioning this because you might come across it when you search burning bush. That the bush was an acacia tree, and that acacia releases DMT or something in there, that it's one of those plants that has that psychoactive substance in it. I don't know if you've heard of that
No, but maybe going along with
theory
that, I
discussed.
do find it interesting that most of well, I think all of the miracles or I guess miracles, but even more specifically, like the way that God is presented. I guess angels are kind of arguable on this one, but what I'm saying is they're like semi-explainable or relatable events. It wasn't like God created or would have created I don't know, 1,000-foot monster or something. Like he might as well have, right? Like why, I mean, I don't know. The pillar of fire, you can sort of explain that with like a tornado and a fire source or something. Um, Pillars of salt, like we recognize what salt is. Why is it always something that's explainable, kind of, and able to be questioned instead of like, why wasn't it ever just like this enormous, completely black void or something like?
I mean,
Why
you
wasn't it
could
ever
see
something
just like,
completely inexplicable?
I mean, there are things that are, like Jonah being swallowed by a whale, or not, it doesn't say a whale, so it's a great fish. And even the events like the plagues in Exodus, people have tried to explain it by like it could have been a volcanic eruption that caused, but just the chain of events, the odds that it was just like coincidence after coincidence that it happened then and how it happened, and but yeah, that is a good question. And some of the, well, I guess we could use the and this is going way forward in the Old Testament. Was it Elijah and the prophets of Baal, the one that answers by fire? It was Elijah, not Elisha, right? Yeah.
Right.
So they had these priests of this idol, or the god they worship, Baal, and they had an altar with an ox, and then Elijah had an altar with an ox, and it's like whoever's God answers by consuming the offering with fire is is God, basically. So long story short, their ox didn't, they tried everything, and their ox didn't burn up, and then he went and he poured water on his ox, or his like whole everything. He poured water on it just to kind of prove a point, and fire came out of the sky and burned up and fell on the offering and burned it up. And you could say like, well, I mean, maybe a meteorite, came right in the right spot to hit that spot there, but that would be like I don't know the odds of that, but right at that time, right at that spot, some, a meteorite hit it or something. I mean, so it could be, again, it could be something like that where it's anyway. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that because that's a theory that's floating around today with the burning bush, that it was that Moses experienced God through a psychoactive, kind of had like a trip with the acacia bush burning there.
Yeah.
Not peyote, but anyway. But so the other question is, it seems the way things are worded, and I know this isn't, did God just notice what was happening? It almost seems like the way it was, and I am going to go to Genesis 15 to show that this was something that was pre-planned, or I guess ordained, that they would have to wait 400 years before they would be delivered. But the way this is kind of worded, it's like, I've noticed, I've seen their oppression, and their cries have gone up to me, and what was it that I've been paying close attention, so it's kind of like and to me, that's one of the most human aspects of this whole interaction, God speaking to Moses like a person, like he's paying close attention to something. Of course, God is always paying attention to everything, but he's paying close attention to this particular situation now. Now, if we look at
it only took him
Genesis,
400
400
years.
years.
But he's been paying close attention.
Close attention.
Eh,
So in Genesis 15:12 through 15, God is talking with Abraham and making a covenant with Abraham about the nation that's going to come from his descendants and what they're going to do and what's going to happen. Let's see, Genesis 15, 12 through 15. So the sun went down, and a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, a dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. Then I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go down to your fathers in peace and be buried in a good old age. Well, I'll read verse 16 too. And they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So this does reveal that this whole slavery for 400 years thing was part of God's plan.
where was that
even
read
though
from
I would,
just now?
Genesis 15.
Oh, okay.
So, God was certainly aware during those 400 years, but I think in one translation it says, let them know, he's saying when you go talk to the Israelites, the Lord has met with us, and
What was?
There's a translation that I was looking at that says, I have gone down and visited them. This is what God was saying to Moses. I've gone down and visited them and seen their oppression. So it's almost
What?
like what's that?
Was there slavery like some form of long-term punishment or something? Why did they go into, why was that part of the plan?
Well, so the Egyptians, yeah, I mean that is a good question. Why, I mean that would certainly be a way to keep them from going back to the land. I mean, God wanted them to not go back to where they were supposed to be for 400 years. So keeping them there, that was a way to keep them there. I mean, I could see that, but
A little excessive.
I would hate to be a slave. I would hate to be in the middle of that because there were generations that lived during that 400 years that never knew anything else, right?
Yeah.
And I guess that's kind of getting to a theme on this, that it's, God, I guess a major point of this whole passage kind of talks about God's timing, and the fact that Moses was 80 years old before he even started on his real main purpose. And the people had been there for 400 years before this happened. So it's kind of something to consider. So it does seem that it was time. I mean, it was definitely time for this to happen because 400 years had elapsed, and it was time for them to be delivered. Um, Bill, do you have any thoughts as to why God allowed them to be slaves for 400 years? Was it like a humility thing, or was it
I think it was because he wanted them to have time to become a nation. He
yeah,
wanted them to have time. Pardon
So was
me.
it, so it's a
He
team
wanted
building
them. He wanted them
exercise.
to have time to become a unified group. And at that time, they were ready as this unified group to be able to strike out together. And before, they were just, a bunch of families.
when they first started, they were just 72 people, right? And then
Yeah,
they grew to millions of people, right?
right.
Which I guess could happen over 400 years if you have a lot of kids, which they did, it says. Um, and also, they were not supposed to return, so that could also explain some of it. The nature of the slavery, I know when we're here in 2024, where we are, when we think of slavery, we think of the slavery that was here 200 years ago. But it was probably a little bit different for the Israelites in Egypt. It seemed like kind of like forced. I mean, I guess they didn't have the freedom to leave, and it was like forced labor. But I've always
Well,
seen it as being oppression and bad, but not necessarily as severe. Like they weren't being bought and sold; they were just like being forced to build the monuments. And I mean, maybe they were being bought and sold by the Egyptians, but it doesn't seem like.
I don't
well,
think
they
they
had
were
to work.
necessarily being mistreated by the Egyptians as much as popular culture might suggest.
Right.
I could be wrong, but I think slavery. Well, I was just actually listening to something about the Roman Empire yesterday or day before yesterday, I guess, while I was driving, and it was talking about the different like kind of what you could afford, what your lifestyle was like at different income levels during that time. And part of that, they talked like at the highest level they talked about there would be like a kind of multi-millionaire today, but not like a enormous millionaire, just like you're kind of, we'll say, run-of-the-mill millionaire. um like they could have a few slaves, but like they were always treated really well because slaves were a big investment. Um, and yeah, yeah, I mean, it's still slavery, obviously, but yeah, the slaves were viewed as part of the family, and often slaves were um, like bought out or freed, set free, so that they could marry them.
Hmm. And there
But
is
just
that.
a,
I mean, yeah,
and that's an almost similar, not exactly the same time frame, but I mean the same kind of society, basically.
yeah. I mean,
Or the
well, when
same.
you look at the regulations for like servants, like in the Old Testament, it uses the word servant and slave kind of interchangeably, and it does mention like if you wanted to marry, like if you married one of them, that they would become a full wife, basically.
Yeah.
And you had to set them free after a certain amount of time. Maybe that was just talking about fellow Israelites, but I mean, they
Mhm.
weren't supposed. That does get kind of confusing because I mean, you have the year of Jubilee where you're supposed to free them, but it never seems quite as. And there were also punishments for like if you beat your slave and killed your slave, you would be punished for that. Wasn't.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess a jail cell is still a jail cell if you.
Yeah, if you can't leave,
Yeah.
but um yeah, it's just something to consider. I mean, and it was evidently they had enough. I was thinking about this, that Egypt was. I mean, this is how they ended up in Egypt to begin with. That Egypt was the place to go. I mean, Joseph had them save up the grain and stuff because the famine did affect them then. But Egypt always was kind of like a more stable place. Egypt was a very stable place. So if you were going to grow into a multitude of people, it would seem like if you had to be trapped somewhere, if you were trapped in Egypt, that would be the place to live.
Yeah.
Because if you were living anywhere else, you would have you because Egypt was very difficult to attack because it was like a river that was surrounded by desert. And it was the agriculture and stuff was very stable because it was just the flooding, the flooding of the Nile, and stuff would grow out of that. They weren't really dependent on it raining there. Um, so again, that could have been also part of God's plan, but it still would have been kind of awful to be one of those people who was like 200 years in, right in the middle of it, and not, your parents were slaves and your children were slaves, and you know, but um, and also, I mean, evidently Moses needed to be 80 years old before he was.
Yeah. And I don't know, like if I was one of the people living then and somebody came in and said, "Hey, the God of your father's father's father or whatever, is back," I'd have been like, "Oh, joy. Great. You mean the God that like let us all become slaves?" Great.
There probably was some of that sentiment. I mean, I mean, if you look later on in Exodus, I mean, it doesn't initially the things that happen, the Pharaoh doesn't let them go right away. In fact, makes things worse for them, and
Yeah.
they try to kill Moses themselves. So I did want to ask: is there a human aspect? Because this is our series. Is there a human aspect of God in this interaction so far that you see, other than what we've kind of mentioned? God does talk to Moses like another person and kind of uses terms like I've seen what's going on. I've visited down there. They're cries have reached my, there's probably a translation that says their cries have reached my ear, or, their cries have gone up to me. It is kind of interesting that those terms are used, but is there another like human aspect that you see in God in this passage? Think amongst yourselves if you wish. But, I mean, I definitely see the divine in here, because God's basically saying what's going to happen, and that he has knowledge and insight of what's going on, and what's going to happen. Okay, you're going to tell them this, then Pharaoh's not going to let them go, and then I'm gonna, let's see, does it mention that in here? Well, it does say, oh, okay, yeah, but I will know that the king of Egypt will not let you go. So he's already saying, I know that the king of Egypt's not going to let you go, with all the wonders that I will do after.
Well,
yeah.
the only human aspect I would say is that as it was being read, I thought it was interesting that he was defining himself by human terms. Like when Moses asked how he should, what they should call him. Essentially, he like defined himself as the God of Jacob and other humans.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, that is an interesting point. Yeah.
instead of like, I am the Father Almighty kind of thing, or I'm Lord of the
Well,
universe and creator
the
of heaven
statement
and
I
earth.
am,
I don't know.
though, is pretty much like I am, like I've always been. Essentially, I've always been, and I always will be. It's like a.
True.
But then also, yeah, at the same time, he is kind of using those qualifiers, like or God is using those like identifiers and using the his relationship with past people to kind of show a history. Yeah, so I can kind of see. Yeah, I can see what you're saying there with that. That is interesting. Um, there's really so much to talk about in this. So
Well,
yeah, good.
there where he's, you were talking about the name, I am, and I will be who I will be. He starts off, he gets Moses' attention by being in this bush, which is eye-catching because it's burning, but it's unusual because it's not burning up. So that's what's drawing Moses over there, not so much the fact that it's burning, but the fact that it's not burning up. And Moses comes over there and he's stopped and told by God to take off your sandals because this is holy ground. And Moses doesn't necessarily understand, but he has been living in this religious or this holy household. I mean, his father-in-law is the
Was a
priest of
pagan,
Midian.
right?
Well,
Was he a pagan or what? I mean, I do kind of have questions about that. That is, was the priest of Midian a monotheist, or was he a?
well, we really don't know what the priest of Midian was.
I know people have kind of postulated that he was he heathen pagan worshiping guy, and that, and I've always found it weird that Moses took a wife, and that, Jethro was kind of like, well, it almost seemed like his father-in-law Jethro was kind of like, well, your God, my God, it's all kind of good.
Uh, I've kind of gotten the impression that he was a monotheist, because God didn't really object to him at all.
Well, that is true. Yeah.
But anyway, and Moses was trained by him for 40 years to be prepared to take over his role for the next 40 years. So I don't know how offensive to God he would be.
Something that's always struck me too about Moses and the priest of Midian, and it's entirely possible that Moses was familiar with the Egyptian mystery school, and like had a lot of that knowledge, like formal training as a prince that he would have received. But as far as his knowledge of God, it almost seems like he's learning through experience. Like he's experiencing this burning bush, but he doesn't know about, who knows how much Moses knows about Abraham, and God's mentioning these names. But Moses grew up as a Egyptian prince, and then he knew he was a Hebrew, but he didn't grow up in that. So how much knowledge did he really have about the whole history? But he does also, he's credited with putting down the oral traditions. That Moses wrote Genesis, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, right, and Numbers, right?
Yeah.
So he could have gotten that knowledge as he was, from Joshua or somebody, as he was leading the people out. But it seems like he's kind of, at this stage, he was selected for this purpose, but it doesn't seem like he was somebody who really had much knowledge of this God the Hebrews worshipped. Even though he was a Hebrew, but he was an Egyptian prince, and he was living in Midian. And then also the priest of Midian,
So was Moses not a Jewish God follower until the burning bush?
Well, that's kind of the question I have. He comes to realization that he is a Hebrew, right? Or am I just getting Exodus confused with the Charlton Heston movie, that he's like an adult and he comes to the realization that he's a Hebrew, or does he know?
Well, he knows he was a Hebrew, and he would have been made fun of in the shower by all of the Egyptian guys all of his life, because he would have been the only circumcised fellow there.
So who was it that his wife circumcised? Was that his children, or that wasn't Moses, right?
No. That would have
That was
been
his children. Okay. I'm jumping a chapter ahead, or two chapters, but that was.
I think his father-in-law would have probably circumcised his children.
Well, Zipporah. Remember when they're going back to Egypt and they're at the lodge, and Zipporah circumcised Moses' wife, circumcised somebody. And
well, now that's true. I'd forgotten that.
Let me see, because we don't want to leave a stone unturned. That's a fascinating story too. But we'll get to it, but I do want to, just for the sake of accuracy,
Forgotten that. I'm sorry.
at a lodging place, this is chapter 4, Exodus 4, verse 24. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met with him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah, Moses' wife, took a flint, and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it. So, but I thought Moses had 2 kids. Was the other one born after this, or?
I thought they had 2 children.
So maybe he didn't have an
Maybe.
adult. Maybe he didn't have an adult child when this was, because that'd be kind of awkward.
I don't remember. I was. It's been a long time since I read that.
Let me see. Moses flees to
apologize.
Midian. Oh, it just mentions the birth of Gershom, the one son here. So maybe, I don't know. I mean, the timeline's kind of, we're not really given a firm. We're just told the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. And then he gave one of his daughters to Moses as a wife, Zipporah. And she gave birth to a son named Gershom. But it doesn't say when that happened. But Moses had been there for 40 years. So I don't know. But I suppose it could have been an adult son she circumcised, but that would be kind of painful.
Yeah.
I guess it's painful if you're just not I mean, I guess it is if you're like an infant, but or a baby even, that you're just not aware of it.
Yeah, you
But
wouldn't remember it if you were an infant.
yeah.
I don't remember being circumcised.
Well, there you have it.
But anyway. But anyway, God got Moses' attention.
Yeah.
And he brought him onto holy ground. And these were all things that Moses was familiar with. And then God explained to Moses who he was. And at that point, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look upon God. And I think that is really important, because at that point, we're told that Moses was looking at God.
Well, he avoided it.
Well,
But that is maybe that's what you were driving at earlier, William. But that is one of the few times God is direct contact.
Yeah. Was he looking at God through a smoke screen?
I mean, God was talking to him, but it wasn't until God explained who he was that Moses knew who he was talking to.
Yeah.
And at that point, Moses covered his face.
Yeah. And I guess it is possible that God gave him knowledge along the way, because I guess that's always a question I have, that he feels he feels unqualified, and it could have been because of his age that he feels unqualified to go and do this. It could be because, he's afraid that there's still people there that know who he is or remember him. Or it could be that Moses also knows that even though he's a Hebrew, he didn't grow up as a Hebrew. He wouldn't really be familiar with their customs or would he know their language? I mean, would they be speaking the same language as the Egyptians at this point? Or they would probably know Egyptian, right? I mean, the Hebrews would probably know Egyptian and they would probably know Hebrew, I would guess.
Yeah. They
Yeah.
would both.
So I guess he
They
could
would
address
know
them.
both. They would know both languages.
But that's
when they-
another thing. You would have to learn Hebrew to write the scriptures later on. So I guess those are kind of some unanswered questions. But I mean, I guess he somehow had received the knowledge he needed at the time. And he did say that as we'll look at later on in chapter 4, he was slow of speech. Moses was not an eloquent speaker, so he kind of tried to use that as an excuse, like send somebody else. I can't really speak well, you know. So just some thoughts on applying this. There's a lot in Moses' story that is kind of, oh, well, I mean, it not just kind of, I mean, it is inspirational in the fact that God used him when he was 80 years old, and his life experiences up to this point really wouldn't have made much sense until it all kind of comes together at this point. Because he was a prince, and then he killed somebody, or he murdered an Egyptian, and people found out about it. Then he had to flee, and then he was in the wilderness for 40 years. And so I've heard it said before, those first 40 years, he learned how to be a leader. He learned how to be a leader. He got some kind of formal education as a prince. He learned how to conduct himself as a leader. And then when he was in the wilderness for 40 years, he learned how to survive and navigate the wilderness. So I've heard it said that perhaps God allowed him to go through humility. Oh, you said humility too, yeah.
That's what I was gonna say. He learned. Yeah, got two opposite experiences.
Yeah. So he was 80 years old before he was, I guess we're all a work in progress, but he was 80 years old before he was ready, for this great task. So something to consider for our own lives and calling and purpose, that God has for us, and also just our experiences, and not just the experiences of the Israelites in the 400 years and the waiting, but also Moses and the 80 years. And his life was he had kind of settled into at least a very familiar situation, and he was at least not afraid of losing his life as a shepherd. And he was kind of winding down, but then he got his real purpose comes along right then. So why that other question too, I guess, was related to that. I had written down, why are we allowed to go through certain experiences? And also Moses had certain limitations too. I mean, he was old, he couldn't speak well, and God did kind of have a solution for that, and that Aaron was going to be his spokesperson. But why didn't God fix Moses's speech impediment?
Yeah.
I mean, that is kind of a, and it could be that, again, that could be a humility thing too. I mean, we do know that it says that Moses, when he died, he was 120. So his life was like 40, 40, 40. So he was 120 when he died, and he was still full of energy. I mean, it uses a slightly different word, but it basically means he was still, even
Virile.
though he virile, yeah, he looked like an old man, but he was still virile. Yeah. So um even though he was 120, so that could be some kind of supernatural gift. I mean, he needed the strength to lead the people, but it is kind of interesting that it never says that he was cured of his speech issue. Um, maybe he got over it. I don't know. Maybe he was exaggerating his speech issue when he was trying to use it as an excuse. Don't necessarily know. I mean, he definitely felt unqualified, but also he had to go through all these experiences before he came to this point. So, um, those are just my thoughts on this, and we'll kind of I almost said recircle back, but circle back next week. We look at chapter 4, because chapter 4 does come after chapter 3, and we're gonna, you know, be looking at that. And also something to consider is that, and in all of these passages we look at, that God relates to us, is going to sound kind of redundant, but God relates to us in a relatable way. Um, but God is still God. So, God talked to Moses and allowed Moses to object, and there was kind of this back and forth conversation. Um, and we'll see more of that in chapter 4, because Aaron comes along. Because Moses will say, like, well, I can't speak, and then God will say, like, well, Moses, Aaron, your brother's on his way to see you, and I know he can speak well. So, now Aaron becomes part of the plan. So, um, any other thoughts on this?
I think there was a lot wrapped up in Moses learning God's name.
Yeah.
I think that whole process of Moses learning that God is I am, and Moses being placed in the position of having to express that to the people of Israel. I think that's important to consider.
Yeah. Definitely. Definitely. I mean, it is a very,
I
as a
think it
way
is
to
something.
describe God, it's a very concise. That's the word I was looking for. It's very, like, well, I am who I am. I don't have a cause, or, I
I
don't have
think it
a,
is something that people today can't grasp. People today are fine calling him God. But if they had to take a minute and call him I am, I think that would give a lot of people pause.
Well, because everything we see has something that came before that caused it. Well, even a person being born other than God, there's nothing that came before God. We can look at a tree, it was a seed, and then the person came from two other people, and and they came from people, and they, so
yeah, I mean,
yeah,
there is a lot of a problem when people start really thinking about their God and his name. I mean, people no longer think about names really meaning anything in connection with the people they know.
yeah.
Well, because names are given at birth, and I mean,
yeah,
it's kind of like the fact that you've got big ears or little ears doesn't mean anything. It's just something that it's something you didn't earn, essentially, is what I'm getting at. Like, it's just given to you at birth. Like, why would people consider a name meaning something when it comes to a human anyway? Like,
well, it would mean something about their origins, at least. Like Moses named his child Gershom, for example, because Gershom means I'm a sojourner. I'm a sojourner. I'm a sojourner in a foreign land. So it's basically he's naming his child to make a statement.
Yeah, but that's got everything to do with the parent and nothing to do with the kid.
Yeah, well, that
you could
is
name
true.
Your kid
that is true.
Purple. It doesn't make him purple.
Yeah. I guess it does reflect the will of the parents. Your name reflects the will of what your parents decided to name you.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that people no longer think about things like that.
Yeah.
And
there are a lot of names that don't really mean anything now. Have no.
That's true.
But anyway, but that is an important filter when we look at these stories. The names, because the names are always. Moses means something too. Drawn out of the water. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, without further ado, that is. I think I said this was episode 32, but this is episode 32, and we've made it this far. So
Indeed.
There you go. Join us next time as we look at Exodus chapter 4. We continue in this interaction. Exodus 4 is very interesting. Has some I say that about everything. Well, everything we look at, we don't look at anything that isn't interesting, right? So hope you have a good week or day if you're listening to this, and we do appreciate you listening, and we will see you next time.